Every single year, if you look at the global numbers, billions of dollars in foreign aid just flow into developing nations.
Right. Yeah, it's a massive amount of capital.
It really is. And I mean, it is a story we are all incredibly familiar with, right? You see it on the evening news all the time.
Oh, absolutely. A wealthy nation stands at a podium and announces this massive grant for, agricultural development or something.
Exactly. Or like emergency infrastructure or medical supplies. And the narrative is just always one of global generosity.
It's the default framing.
Right. But what if I told you that for every single dollar going in through the front door, vastly more wealth is quietly, like systematically flowing out the back door?
I mean, it completely shatters the narrative, doesn't it?
It really does.
When you start actually looking at the mechanics of global finance, things like corporate profit repatriation, sovereign debt servicing, and illicit financial flows, the whole picture just flips.
Yeah, it's like a totally different reality.
You suddenly have to ask yourself whether the wealthy world is actually funding the developing world or if, the developing world is still subsidizing the wealthy world.
And that paradox, that exact tension, is why you were joining us for today's deep dive.
It's a big one today.
Oh, it's huge. We are stepping into some deeply complex, honestly incredibly muddy waters here. We're looking at a topic that challenges, well, basically some of our most basic assumptions about global wealth.
Yeah, the foundational stuff.
Exactly. And it all centers around this massive, monumental question derived from a really fascinating document we've been poring over.
Which is simply titled Question 90.
Right, question 90. And the question is just this. Do rich countries owe a debt to poor countries?
It is a question that it instantly makes people sit up a little straighter, I think.
Oh, definitely.
Because it touches on literally everything. I mean, history, morality, economics, and honestly, our fundamental sense of who we are today in relation to the rest of the planet.
Yeah, it gets personal really fast. But before we go a single step further, we need to pause and establish some very clear ground rules for this deep dive.
Very important, yes.
Because the material we are analyzing today, it touches on highly, highly politically charged themes. We're talking about global wealth distribution, colonialism, historical grievances, reparations.
It's a minefield.
It is. So it is absolutely crucial for you to know that we are not here to take sides.
No, not at all.
We are not approaching this from a left-wing perspective, nor are we coming at it from a right-wing perspective. We are honestly not endorsing any specific viewpoints or policies here.
Exactly. Our only mission today is to act as your guides through the material.
Just your guides.
We are impartially reporting, unpacking, and analyzing the ideas, the arguments, and the counter-arguments exactly as they are presented in the source text.
Right, we're just laying it all out.
We are here to map out the philosophical and historical terrain so that, so you can navigate it and make sense of it completely for yourself.
We are just holding up the map. So, setting the table here. Let's think about that default language we hear every single day when money moves from a wealthy nation to a poorer one.
Right, the vocabulary we use.
Yeah, we hear words like aid, we hear assistance, we hear international development.
And above all, we hear the language of generosity.
Generosity, yes. It is always framed as this act of charity.
And that framing is so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness, right? It's in our international institutions, our media. We rarely ever pause to question it.
It just feels self-evident.
Exactly. The logic is, we have a lot of resources. They have fewer resources, so we are being generous by giving some of ours to them.
Makes total sense on the surface.
But what this framework does, and what's really fascinating here is how quickly it flips the script, is it introduces a complete paradigm shift.
Okay.
It asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What if that language of generosity is a smokescreen?
Okay, let's unpack this, because you're saying that when a wealthy country sends, I don't know, say, $50 million to a developing nation for a water project, they aren't just being nice.
Right.
What else could it possibly be?
Well, we need to look at the historical timeline. The wealth of the modern world did not just spontaneously generate out of thin air.
Right, it didn't just pop into existence.
Exactly. It didn't emerge in this historical vacuum where, some countries just worked a little harder and invented better machines while others just sat idle.
Which is kind of the myth we sometimes tell ourselves.
It is. But the prosperity of wealthy nations today was profoundly shaped by centuries of specific, highly engineered global interactions.
Okay, like what specifically?
We were talking about colonialism. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Massive continent-scale resource extraction,
Right.
deeply unequal trade agreements, land seizures, violent political domination.
That's a heavy list.
It is, and the key is that these were not just unfortunate historical events that happened to occur. They were economic systems explicitly designed to benefit certain societies while simultaneously impoverishing others.
So the core tension we are trying to untangle today is this massive web of concepts. We are talking about guilt versus responsibility.
Yes.
We are talking about compensation versus charity. And ultimately, I guess we are talking about justice.
Precisely.
Because if the wealth of the rich world was built, at least in part, on the engineered exploitation of the poor world, then the money flowing back today isn't charity.
Right.
It is the repayment of a debt.
Exactly. The psychological shift there is massive. It moves from viewing these financial transfers as acts of benevolence to viewing them as the settling of an ongoing account.
Which brings us to defining what this debt actually is. Because I have to admit, when I hear the word debt, my mind immediately goes to, like, my credit card statement.
Sure, or mortgage.
Yeah, a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. It's a very specific, mathematically precise number with a compounding interest rate attached to it. There's a ledger,
Right, a literal spreadsheet.
But the framework we are exploring makes a really important distinction here. We are moving away from abstract financial ledgers and into, well, our own moral intuitions.
We are. It clarifies right away that we are not talking about a standard financial invoice.
Okay.
You aren't going to see a scenario where a developing nation drafts a PDF invoice, attaches it to an email, and sends it to a wealthy European capital saying, net 30 days, please remit 400 billion euros for centuries of colonial rule.
Yeah, that's just practically and legally impossible.
Exactly. There is no international collection agency that handles history.
Right. So if it's not a bill in the mail, what is it?
What we are discussing is a moral and political obligation. The definition we are working with is that a debt might mean one society has obligations toward another because it benefited from unjust arrangements that demonstrably harmed the other.
Benefiting from an unjust arrangement that harms someone else. Okay, I want to dive into the strongest argument presented for how that actually happened mechanically.
The historical exploitation argument.
Yes, exactly. How did this wealth transfer actually work on the ground?
Well, if we look at how many wealthy states accumulated their power and their foundational capital, it involved an enormous transfer of wealth, labor, and natural resources from dominated societies back to the imperial centers.
Okay.
Let's look at the mechanics of it. It wasn't just standard trade. It was forced extraction.
Right, the raw materials. We're talking about the silver, the gold, the rubber, the cotton.
Raw materials, yes, absolutely. I mean, entire ecosystems were re-engineered to produce cash crops for export rather than food for the local population.
Wow, just totally rewritten landscape.
Exactly. But it was also human labor. Through colonial rule, forced labor quotas, the transatlantic slave trade, the extraction of minerals, and, the total monopoly control of global shipping and trade routes.
So they controlled the whole board.
They did. And the crucial point here is that this transferred wealth didn't just evaporate into the ether. It directly funded the foundations of the modern wealthy world.
Okay, walk me through that connection. Because I think it's easy to picture galleons full of gold just being spent on lavish palaces for kings, which are now just, tourist traps.
Right, fancy museums.
Yeah. So how did it build the modern economy?
Because it provided the seed capital for modern capitalism.
Oh, I see.
The profits from colonial extraction and slavery didn't just buy luxury goods. They were deposited into financial institutions. They literally capitalized the early banks.
Wow.
And then those banks issued loans for massive infrastructure. Railways, deepwater ports, roads, telegraph lines. They funded the commercial development that made the Industrial Revolution possible.
It's all connected.
Deeply connected. The factories in Manchester or the financial houses on Wall Street were deeply intertwined with the cotton produced by enslaved labor in the American South and the wealth extracted from India and the Caribbean.
So it's literally the seed money. The structural foundation of the modern wealthy world was, in many tangible cases, extracted from somewhere else.
It was. And that leads to a very simple yet incredibly powerful moral intuition.
Which is?
If you possess benefits that were created through wrongful harm, you may owe something to those who continue to bear the consequences of that harm.
But hold on. I have to push back here because I can practically hear you, the listener, shouting this objection at your device right now.
Oh, I know exactly what's coming.
It is the most common, immediate, visceral reaction anyone has to this topic.
Mm.
And it's just, but I didn't do it.
It is the most natural human reaction in the world, and honestly, it's factually correct.
Right. I mean, a 20-year-old born today in London or Madrid or New York is obviously not personally guilty of slavery.
No, of course not.
They didn't order colonial violence. They didn't draw up exploitative resource treaties in the 1880s. How can you possibly hold a 20-year-old software developer or a barista responsible for the sins of a Victorian empire?
You can't.
It just violates our basic sense of individual fairness.
And the framework completely acknowledges this. It states very clearly that the 20-year-old is absolutely not personally guilty. It would be entirely unfair and frankly absurd to treat them as such.
Okay, good. That's a relief.
But this is where we have to introduce a crucial philosophical distinction. We have to draw a very firm line between guilt and responsibility.
Okay, guilt versus responsibility. Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm tracking this, because I think this is where the rubber really meets the road.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you inherit this beautiful piece of property, like a stunning house, acres of land, a gorgeous orchard.
Sounds lovely.
It is. And it's been in your family for 3 generations. You move in, you're enjoying the garden, you're raising your kids there. Everything is great.
Okay, I'm with you.
And then one day, you're up in the attic fixing a leak, and you find this old lockbox.
Yeah.
Inside is a diary and some old, undeniable legal documents. And you discover, without a shadow of a doubt, that your grandfather didn't buy this property. He stole it.
Ah.
A violent theft, we assume?
Yes, exactly. He used violence, he forged the deeds, and he forcefully evicted the rightful owners.
Wow.
And it gets worse. You find out that the descendants of those rightful owners currently live just down the road. And because their ancestors were robbed of their primary asset, they have lived in grinding intergenerational poverty ever since.
That is a brutal realization.
Right. Now, let's be totally clear here. You didn't steal the house. You were born decades later. You are completely innocent of the actual crime. You have zero guilt.
Agreed. You committed no crime.
But now that you know its origin, do you have an absolute unlimited moral right to just keep it, shrug your shoulders, and say, hey, not my problem, I wasn't there?
That is the exact analogy that unlocks this entire argument.
Really?
Yes, because you are not guilty of the theft. The police aren't going to arrest you for grand larceny, but you are currently holding the stolen goods.
I have the house. You have the house. You are enjoying the advantages, the security, and the wealth produced by an injustice. And importantly, the consequences of that injustice have not disappeared.
Because the descendants are still poor down the street.
Exactly. They are still suffering the direct deprivation caused by that theft.
So the responsibility isn't about self-flagellation. It isn't about looking in the mirror and saying, I am a bad person who committed a terrible crime.
No, not at all. It's about looking at your current situation and saying, I am a beneficiary of a historical crime, and because I hold the benefits while others continue to hold the harm, I have a responsibility to make repair.
Because you inherit the advantage.
Exactly. You inherit the advantages, and therefore you inherit a level of responsibility. They are a package deal. You can't separate them.
That is a really tough pill to swallow. I mean, it completely challenges the myth of the self-made individual. But logically, I get it. It's a very clear distinction.
It is challenging, yeah.
However, that brings up the next massive hurdle. In my analogy, we're talking about grandfathers and grandchildren. That's what, 60, maybe 80 years?
Roughly, sure.
We can wrap our heads around that time frame. But the historical exploitation we are discussing here goes back much, much further. We are talking about centuries, the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s.
Deep history.
Yeah. How does a moral debt survive across hundreds of years when every single perpetrator and every single direct victim has been dead for generations? Can a state actually inherit sins?
This is one of the deepest philosophical problems we have to navigate, because you're totally right. Individuals die, a human lifespan is incredibly short.
Right.
But states, institutions, they persist for centuries. The entity known as the United Kingdom or the Republic of France or the United States, these are continuous legal and political entities. They literally don't die of old age.
Right. The state is just this continuous machine.
And what's crucial here is that modern governments and societies are perfectly happy to inherit the benefits of their predecessors.
And they love the benefit.
They eagerly inherit the territory won in ancient treaties. They inherit Public property, government buildings, national parks, infrastructure, and all these massive institutional frameworks that were established hundreds of years ago.
It's the continuity of the state. You can't
Yeah.
just cherry pick the good stuff and reject the rest.
Exactly. And there is a massive hypocrisy if you try to do that. Governments accept legal and financial continuity all the time.
Like what?
Well, think about sovereign debt. When a newly elected administration takes office, they look at the national debt bonds issued by previous governments, sometimes decades ago, to fund wars or infrastructure, and they don't get to say, well, our specific cabinet didn't personally borrow this money, so we are just going to void the national debt. Clean slate.
Could you imagine? Imagine trying that with your bank.
It wouldn't go well.
If you walk in and say, look, I know my name's on the mortgage, but that was the 2015 version of me who signed it. The 2026 version of me owes you absolutely nothing. Good day?
The bank would laugh you right out of the room.
They really would. And they'd foreclose on your house. So if financial obligations and legal treaties definitively survive generations, why wouldn't moral obligations?
That is the core of the state continuity argument right there. Political communities are intergenerational projects.
They span centuries.
They do. They inherit both assets and liabilities, both material wealth and moral obligations. You simply cannot divorce the two. If the state is continuous enough to own the wealth, it is continuous enough to owe the debt.
Okay, I follow that. But let me play the skeptic again, because I'm thinking about the messy real-world mechanics of this.
It does get messy.
Very messy. How do we actually know what caused what? Let's talk about the problem of causation. How much of a developing nation's current poverty right now in 2026 is actually provably caused by historical exploitation?
It's a very fair question.
Because if you look at the world today, it is complicated. Geography plays a massive role. Access to navigable rivers, climate, political leadership plays a huge role. We see rampant local corruption, terrible macroeconomic policies, civil wars that have absolutely nothing to do with European colonialism. It feels like a massive stretch to blame a country's low GDP today entirely on some trade policy from 1890.
And that skepticism is entirely valid. We have to warn very strongly against a simplistic binary story where rich country equals evil exploiter and poor country equals innocent victim.
It's never that simple.
Never. History is vastly, infinitely more complicated than a simple comic book narrative.
Give me some nuance on that. How does the causation actually break down?
Well, history doesn't move in straight lines. Some countries that were historically very poor and even colonized are now incredibly wealthy.
Oh, true. Look at parts of East Asia.
Exactly. Conversely, some former empires have declined significantly in their relative global power and wealth. Some societies that were violently colonized managed to develop rapidly post-independence, while others with seemingly similar histories just struggled endlessly.
So you can't just draw a straight line.
You really can't. You cannot draw a perfectly straight, mathematically clean line from a colonial policy in 1880 to a specific GDP figure today. There are thousands of intervening variables: technology, leadership, global market shifts.
Plus, there's the whole counterfactual problem.
Yes, the what-if scenario.
Right. What would the world look like if colonialism had never happened?
It is quite literally an impossible question to answer. I mean, the borders of the world would be entirely different. The languages spoken would be different. Economies would have developed along completely unknown organic paths.
We don't have a time machine.
Exactly. We can't boot up a supercomputer and run a simulation of an alternate universe to see exactly how wealthy a specific African or South American nation would be today if they had been left completely alone for 400 years.
So if we can't calculate it, if the causation is that muddy, and the alternate history is basically unknowable, doesn't the whole argument for a debt just collapse under its own uncertainty?
It might seem that way at first.
I mean, if you can't prove the math, you can't collect the debt, right?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, there is a really vital philosophical anchor we need to hold on to here.
Okay.
Perfect calculation is not required to recognize a real wrong.
Say more about that. How does that work in practice?
Think about how our modern legal systems handle complex civil cases. Let's say a massive chemical company illegally dumps toxic waste into a local river for decades.
Okay, classic pollution case.
Right. It ruins the community's health, property values plummet, and local businesses shut down. Eventually, they are taken to court. Now, the court might find it incredibly difficult to calculate the exact down-to-the-penny dollar amount of the economic loss over 30 years.
Because there's so many variables.
Exactly. There are counterfactuals there, too. Maybe the town's economy would have struggled anyway because a nearby highway was rerouted. Maybe some of the health issues were genetic.
Right, the chemical company's lawyers will argue exactly that. They'll say, you can't prove every single case of illness was us.
They absolutely will. But here's the key. The court's uncertainty about the exact perfect dollar figure does not erase the chemical company's fundamental responsibility to compensate the community for the harm they demonstrably caused.
I see. The inability to do perfect math doesn't make the crime disappear.
Precisely. Proving the existence of the historical injustice and its ongoing legacy is easier than calculating exactly how much current inequality it caused.
That makes sense.
The uncertainty complicates how we repair it, absolutely. It means we can't just write a simple check. But it does not eliminate the basic moral responsibility that repair is owed.
Okay, so we've established the philosophical argument for why a debt might exist, why it survives over time, and why imperfect causation doesn't just erase it.
Right.
But I want to move away from the abstract theory for a minute. What did this extraction actually look like? Because we keep using words like injustice and exploitation, which honestly can feel a bit vague.
They can, yes.
I want to look at the deep architecture of extraction. How did the machine actually operate?
To understand the machine, we have to look at the most glaring, undeniable example: slavery.
Yeah.
The transatlantic slave trade creates perhaps the most ironclad version of this debt argument, because it wasn't just about oppression, it was fundamentally about economics.
It's not just about treating people poorly or denying them civil rights, as awful as that is.
No, it was a massive, highly organized, transcontinental system of unpaid labor, and the word unpaid is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Right.
Enslaved people produced the most valuable agricultural goods in the world: sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee. They built physical infrastructure. They generated staggering profits for corporations, trading companies, and empires.
And they did all of this while receiving zero compensation.
Right, good.
Is the ultimate minimum wage literally nothing? It's a 100% profit margin on labor.
And consider the ripple effects of that. While that unpaid labor was generating enormous suffering, physical destruction, and intergenerational trauma for the enslaved populations, the wealth they were producing was rapidly accumulating elsewhere.
It was moving across the ocean?
It was being banked in London, in Paris, in Amsterdam, and New York. It was endowing elite universities, building massive global ports, and capitalizing the early stages of the Industrial Revolution.
So it fueled the growth of the modern world.
It did. So this isn't just a story about inequality happening to exist by chance. This was a deliberate, mechanical transfer of value. It was unpaid extraction.
The language of debt feels incredibly literal there. It's stolen wages with centuries of compound interest.
It does. It shifts from a moral metaphor to an undeniable accounting reality.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. We are talking about stolen money and unpaid wages, which completely makes sense.
Right.
But the deep architecture of extraction didn't just stop at the bank vault. It altered the physical and political landscape of the world. Let's talk about broken foundations.
Ah, yes.
Let's talk about colonial borders and institutions, because this seems like a harm that is entirely separate from just stolen money.
This is a crucial point, and honestly, often the most misunderstood part of historical extraction. The harm of colonialism wasn't purely economic.
It wasn't just stealing the gold.
No, it wasn't just gold bullion and cash crops being loaded onto ships and sent away. The colonial powers completely, often violently, reshaped the societies they dominated.
How so?
They drew borders on maps based on their own administrative convenience or based on treaties negotiated thousands of miles away in European capitals, completely ignoring the ethnic, linguistic, geographic, and historical realities on the ground.
Walk me through the mechanics of that harm. How does a literal line on a map extract wealth or cause a debt?
Well, imagine taking a map of Europe, wiping out all the borders, and then having a foreign power draw massive square blocks over it, forcing the French, the Germans, and the Italians into one administrative zone, while splitting the Spanish across 3 different newly invented countries.
Oh, wow. It would be instant chaos.
Exactly. It would be a disaster. Colonial borders forced historical rival groups inside the same arbitrary boundaries, creating instant, perpetual power struggles.
Because they're fighting for control of a state that shouldn't exist in that shape.
Exactly. Or they split a single, cohesive community across 3 different new countries, destroying their internal trade and political structures.
That's devastating.
Furthermore, the colonial powers imposed foreign legal systems, radically altered traditional land ownership, and set up political institutions. But here is the key. These institutions were designed primarily for extraction and control, not for the flourishing or development of the local population.
Oh, that makes sense. They were built to take things out.
Yes. The police forces were designed to protect colonial assets, not serve the public. The railways were built from the mines straight to the ports, not connecting inland cities to each other.
Wait, really? So the entire physical and legal infrastructure was just this giant funnel pointed at the ocean?
Yes, that's exactly what it was. And when formal colonialism eventually ended, often after violent struggles, the empires left these fragile, artificially constructed, institutionally deformed states behind.
And the argument is that those arbitrary borders and extractive institutions left a permanent legacy of conflict.
We see it today in chronic political instability, devastating civil wars, and weak state capacity that persists right now.
So the true cost isn't just the past.
No, the true cost of historical exploitation isn't just the money that was taken away. The true cost includes the ongoing, deeply expensive consequences generated by these broken political structures long after the colonizers left.
I want to try an analogy for this because I think it helps picture it.
Sure, go ahead.
It's like someone breaking into your house, stealing all your valuables, draining your bank accounts. But on their way out, they take a sledgehammer and smash all the load-bearing pillars in your basement.
That is a phenomenal way to picture it.
Right. Because the theft hurts immediately. You are impoverished today because your money is gone. But the structural damage in the basement, that might be what causes the entire house to collapse 50 years later.
Exactly.
You have to spend all your remaining energy just trying to keep the roof from caving in, which means you can't invest in a new business or send your kids to college. The structural damage is the ongoing cost.
And to tie it back to our core question, does the thief only owe you the stolen money, or do they also owe you for the structural repair of the house they deliberately compromised?
Wow. Okay, so we've looked at the history. We understand the unpaid labor, the broken borders, the smashed load-bearing pillars. But I want to ask you to look at the world right now, today.
Okay, let's look at today.
Because a very reasonable skeptic might be listening and say, fine, history was brutal. Colonialism was terrible. But the empires are gone. The flags have come down.
We live in a new era, they'd say.
Exactly. We live in a modern, globalized, free market world now. Is this strictly a historical debate? Or is the extraction still happening under our noses today?
The evidence makes a very strong case that it is still happening, just in a completely different guise. It points to a profound present-day paradox.
The aid paradox. Let's really dig into this because this is where the evening news narrative completely shatters.
It really does.
Paint that picture for us again. A wealthy nation announces on television, we are generously providing $2 billion in foreign aid to the developing world. The politicians shake hands on a podium, the graphics on the news look fantastic, everyone feels great about it. What is actually happening behind the curtain?
What's fascinating here is that while the public sees the aid flowing in one direction, from rich to poor, they do not see the vastly larger sums of wealth flowing in the exact opposite direction.
The back door.
Yes. The global economic architecture is structured in a way that continues to extract wealth.
Yeah.
Let's break down the mechanisms, because it's not just one thing.
Okay, mechanism number one. Let's talk about corporate profits and illicit financial flows. How does money leave a country that desperately needs it?
Let's start with illicit financial flows, specifically something called trade misinvoicing.
Trade misinvoicing. Okay, sounds technical.
It sounds highly technical, but it's essentially a massive accounting trick. Imagine a multinational mining corporation operating in a developing nation. They are extracting copper.
Got it.
They sell that copper to a subsidiary company they also own, which is conveniently located in a tax haven. But on paper, they sell it for a fraction of what it's actually worth on the global market.
Oh, I see where this is going. So the local government, the developing nation, whose soil the copper actually came from, only gets to tax that tiny, artificially low fraction.
Exactly. The developing nation is starved of tax revenue. Then, the subsidiary in the tax haven turns around and sells the copper on the open global market for its true, massive price.
And they book the profit there.
They book the massive profit there, where taxes are zero or near zero. The physical wealth leaves the soil of the poor country, but the financial value never hits their treasury. Billions and billions of dollars evaporate from the developing world this way every single year.
Wow. It's a mechanical extraction of wealth. And what about sovereign debt? You mentioned earlier how crippling it is. We always hear about IMF loans and World Bank restructuring. How does debt extract wealth?
While developing nations often negotiate from incredibly weak positions, they urgently need capital to build infrastructure or stabilize their currencies, right? So they take on sovereign debt.
Which makes sense. They need money to grow.
But because they are deemed high risk, they often face exorbitant interest rates compared to wealthy nations. Over time, the compounding interest becomes a trap.
It just grows and grows.
Many developing nations today spend more of their national budget simply servicing the interest on foreign debt than they spend on healthcare or education for their own citizens.
Wait, really? So the wealth generated by their citizens' taxes is just being instantly funneled back to banks in New York, London, or Beijing just to cover interest, not even paying down the principal.
Exactly. And to pay that debt, they are often forced to adopt policies that prioritize exporting raw materials as cheaply as possible to generate foreign currency, which keeps them locked at the bottom of the global value chain.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. The overarching argument is that the global economic order systematically allows and even encourages wealth to move from poor populations toward wealthier owners and economies.
It's like giving someone a small bucket of water with one hand while quietly siphoning their well with an industrial pump using the other hand.
That is precisely the paradox. So looking only at the aid bucket is a massive smokescreen. It creates a deeply misleading picture of generosity.
Because it ignores the pump.
Exactly. The framework proposes a new principle for us to consider. Before asking how much rich countries give, we should first ask how much the global system allows them to take.
That fundamentally changes everything about how you view international relations. And it's not just financial extraction today, is it?
No, it's not.
The material brings up a very modern, very urgent, and highly debated version of this debt argument, climate debt.
Yes. This is perhaps the most visceral, most globally consequential contemporary example of the debt framework. Let's think about how wealthy, industrialized nations actually became wealthy.
Well, factories, coal, oil, steel, the internal combustion engine, mass production.
Exactly. They gained their industrial growth, their incredible modern infrastructure, and their massive GDPs by burning fossil fuels. They produced the lion's share of historical carbon emissions over the last century and a half.
They burned the coal and oil that built the modern world.
But the atmospheric consequences of burning all those fuels for the last 150 years?
Are completely borderless.
Yes. And those consequences are falling disproportionately on poorer nations. The nations that contributed the absolute least to global historical emissions, often just a tiny fraction of a percent, are now the most vulnerable to the consequences.
Because of where they are geographically, usually?
Right. We are talking about severe, multi-year droughts wiping out agriculture in East Africa. We are talking about catastrophic flooding in South Asia, lethal heat waves, mass crop failures, and entire coastal communities facing displacement.
So, a country in the global south that barely industrialized, whose citizens have a tiny carbon footprint, is losing its coastline to rising seas caused by factories in Europe and North America that they never even benefited from.
And that creates the concept of a climate debt. You see this heavily debated in global climate summits under the banner of loss and damage.
I've heard that term.
The developing world is essentially saying, you got rich by filling the atmosphere with carbon. Now our homes are underwater. You owe us the resources to adapt.
It's a very clear cause and effect.
It ties back to a very basic, universally understood moral principle. Greater contribution to harm creates greater responsibility for repair.
If you threw this massive party, charged everyone cover, got rich, and totally trashed the neighborhood, you don't get to wake up the next morning and ask the neighbors who weren't even invited to pay for the cleanup.
That's the climate debt in a nutshell.
It is incredibly compelling. But as we move through this, I have to play devil's advocate again on behalf of our skeptical listeners.
Of course.
Because conceptually, philosophically, I am totally following you. The historical extraction, the ongoing structural disadvantages, the illicit financial flows, the climate debt, it all makes logical sense on paper.
But
practically, the logistics of this seem like an absolute nightmare, a complete legal and bureaucratic impossibility. How on earth do you settle a moral debt in a world where borders have shifted, empires have fallen, and billions of people have migrated around the planet?
the logistical challenges are immense. They are honestly staggering. And we cannot shy away from the case against the debt framework.
Right.
There are several very strong, very practical objections that have to be addressed here.
Let's run through them. First objection. Present people should not be punished for their ancestors, or for people who aren't even their ancestors. We touched on this with the stolen property analogy, but let's make it much more specific.
Yeah, okay.
What about someone whose family recently emigrated to a wealthy country? Let's say a family fled violence or extreme poverty in the 1990s. They arrived in the UK or the US or France with literal nothing but the clothes on their backs.
A very common story.
They worked 3 jobs, they struggled, they paid their taxes, and they built a life.
Mm.
Why should their hard-earned tax dollars go toward paying a historical debt for a colonial empire their ancestors had literally nothing to do with? In fact, their ancestors might have been victims of that same empire.
It's a very powerful, highly resonant objection. Our normal, everyday sense of justice treats individuals as responsible for their own actions.
Exactly.
Making a recent working-class immigrant pay a portion of a historical reparations bill for a Victorian empire's sins feels deeply counterintuitive. It feels unjust.
Okay, second major objection. Who exactly counts as the victim? Borders change constantly. People migrate. If a European empire stole wealth from an African kingdom in 1850, but that kingdom no longer exists, and its territory is now split between 3 modern states that have been at war with each other, who gets the check today?
It's incredibly complicated.
And furthermore, what if the current government of that formerly colonized region is deeply corrupt, or an outright authoritarian dictatorship? If you pay a dictator billions of dollars in the name of historical reparations, you aren't compensating the actual people who are suffering. You're just funding their current oppressors.
Another extremely valid point. We see this in international relations all the time. Paying governments does not automatically equate to compensating victims. Often the wealth just pools at the top of a new post-colonial elite.
And the third objection. Who counts as the debtor? Many citizens living in wealthy societies today have ancestors who were themselves deeply oppressed, impoverished, or colonized by the exact same empires we are talking about.
Right, history is layered.
Think of the Irish under British rule. Think of poor, working-class laborers who were brutally exploited in the coal mines and factories of their own countries during the Industrial Revolution. They didn't benefit from global imperialism. They were crushed by the domestic version of it.
They suffered immensely.
How do you untangle that collective historical responsibility? It feels like trying to unbake a cake. You can't separate the flour from the sugar once it's out of the oven.
It really does. If you focus entirely on individual bloodlines, tracing DNA to determine who owes whom, the math is impossible. It is a logistical dead end.
So what's the solution?
Well, this raises an important question, and it's where a profound solution to this logistical nightmare emerges from the source material. We need to shift our focus entirely. We need to stop looking at individuals.
Stop looking at individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Then who are we looking at?
We need to start looking at institutions.
Shift to institutions. Okay, walk me through the nuts and bolts of that.
The argument is that responsibility doesn't attach to your DNA. It doesn't attach to the recent immigrant or the descendant of the coal miner.
Okay, good.
It attaches to the enduring entities that hold the wealth, the power, and the historical continuity. We are talking about governments, yes, but also corporations, universities, massive financial bodies, and public institutions.
So instead of asking, did my great-grandfather do something wrong, the question is what?
The question becomes, does this specific institution, this multinational bank, this elite university, this corporate conglomerate, this government treasury, continue to enjoy the assets, the endowments, and the structural benefits of a past injustice?
Oh, I see.
Let's use a tangible example. If an Ivy League university's original endowment was heavily funded by profits from the slave trade, that university as a continuous legal institution still exists today.
Right, it's still operating.
It is still benefiting from the compound interest on that historical crime. Its
Right.
prestige, its campus, its massive financial leverage are all tied to that origin. Therefore, that institution as an entity inherits the responsibilities connected to that wealth.
That makes it so much more concrete. You aren't billing the recent immigrant who pays taxes. You are looking at the institutional structures that actively hold and deploy the historical wealth right now.
Exactly.
It removes the messy concept of personal guilt entirely and focuses strictly on institutional continuity and possession of assets.
Exactly. It makes reparative justice legally, practically, and philosophically coherent. You don't have to trace bloodlines. You just trace the money and the institutional charters.
Okay, so if we can identify the institutions and we agree that a moral debt exists, the next massive question is execution.
The how?
What does genuine repair actually look like on the ground? Because we've already established we aren't just mailing giant novelty checks to corrupt governments or dictators.
Exactly. Direct cash payments from one treasury to another are only one small possibility, and in many cases, they might be the least effective, most destructive way to attempt to repair the harm.
So if not cash, what are the actual forms of repair? How do you fix a broken foundation?
There is a very diverse, highly strategic set of methods outlined in the text. First, there's debt relief. We talked about how crippling sovereign debt is.
The interest trap.
Right. Canceling or dramatically restructuring the burdensome, high-interest sovereign debt that currently traps many developing nations would instantly free up billions of dollars in their domestic budgets.
Stop the bleeding first. If they don't have to pay New York banks exorbitant interest, they can build their own schools.
Right. It restores immediate fiscal autonomy. Second is infrastructure and public health. This doesn't mean sending a foreign company to build a road and then immediately leave.
Okay, what does it mean?
It means long-term, non-extractive investment in building domestic healthcare systems, education networks, clean water infrastructure, and resilient energy grids.
Going back to our earlier analogy, if the empire smashed the load-bearing pillars in the basement, this is going in and rebuilding the foundation so the house can stand on its own.
Exactly. Then there is technology transfer. This is a massive one for the future. Helping poorer societies gain direct access to vital medicines, clean green technologies, and scientific knowledge, rather than guarding them behind incredibly expensive, prohibitive intellectual property walls.
Sharing the blueprints.
Yes. If we want the developing world to skip the dirty fossil fuel phase of industrialization, we have to share the patents for solar and wind technology.
What about the cultural side? We see this in the news quite a bit lately.
Cultural restitution. Returning the artifacts, the artworks, the sacred objects, and even the human remains that were systematically looted, stolen, and removed during colonial rule, and which now sit behind glass in the museums of the wealthy world.
That is a very visible, highly symbolic form of repair. It's literally returning a society's heritage, and then I'm assuming reforming the very systems we talked about earlier, the illicit flows.
Yes, institutional and global trade reform. Changing the international rules on corporate taxation, closing tax havens, stopping profit shifting, and rewriting trade arrangements that currently disadvantage weaker economies.
So fixing the plumbing.
This is about changing the ongoing relationship, not just apologizing for the past. It's stopping the active extraction.
So what does this all mean? When you look at this list, debt relief, building hospitals, sharing green tech, reforming trade, it sounds an awful lot like the development aid we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
It does look similar on paper.
So are we just arguing over semantics here? Is this just a branding exercise?
That is the exact critique many will raise. Critics will say, look, let's just focus on development. Let's look to the future, build institutions, promote economic growth. Why are we obsessing over the past and using this heavy, contentious language of debt and reparations?
A fair question.
But supporters of the reparative justice framework argue that the language isn't just window dressing. The language fundamentally changes the power dynamic.
How so? Give me the psychological difference there.
Think about the difference in posture. Development assistance or aid says, we, the wealthy, successful, and capable nations, are generously helping you, the poor, struggling, and failing nations.
It's very top-down.
It places the giver in a permanent position of moral superiority. It is fundamentally an act of charity. And here's the thing about charity. You can be grateful for charity, but you cannot demand it. If the giver decides to stop giving, you have absolutely no recourse.
And reparation, the language of debt.
Reparation says, we have a binding obligation to you because of our historical and ongoing relationship. We are inextricably linked.
Wow.
It is the profound difference between generosity and justice. A debt is something that is owed. It recognizes the agency, the equality, and the rights of the receiver, rather than just relying on the fleeting benevolence of the giver.
That is a massive psychological and diplomatic shift. It levels the playing field completely. But there has to be a warning here, right, about how this repair is actually executed. Because pouring massive resources into fragile systems is dangerous.
Yes, there is a very stark warning about the danger of dependency. Even if there is a deeply legitimate moral debt, large, sudden transfers of wealth or resources can sometimes severely backfire.
How does that happen?
Well, if not handled carefully, they can heavily distort local markets. For example, dumping free food into a country can completely bankrupt local farmers, essentially destroying their agricultural sector.
Because they can't compete with free.
Exactly. Massive resource transfers can also weaken local democratic accountability and strengthen corrupt elites who just siphon off the funds.
You don't want to replace colonial domination with permanent financial dependency. You don't want to make them wards of the state.
Exactly. The ultimate goal of reparative justice is to increase autonomy, build robust local institutional capacity, and foster true economic independence. The goal is to end the permanent donor-recipient dynamic entirely and create a more equal peer-to-peer relationship on the global stage.
And there is a very important point we need to emphasize here about not treating poorer societies as just passive victims.
This is a vital nuance. It is very easy and very common in these discussions to inadvertently strip developing nations of their agency, to treat them merely as helpless, passive victims of Western extraction who have no control over their own destiny.
Which isn't true.
But that is deeply paternalistic and historically inaccurate.
Right, because local elites, politicians, and governments in the global south make their own choices every single day. They can be incredibly corrupt. They steal public wealth. They suppress their own citizens. They make disastrous macroeconomic decisions.
And we have to be mature enough to hold two seemingly contradictory truths at once.
What are they?
Truth one, global structures and historical injustices matter deeply and continue to cause massive structural harm. Truth two, local political responsibility and domestic choices matter just as much.
They aren't mutually exclusive.
Recognizing the external structural harm does not require denying internal agency and responsibility. A country can be a victim of historical colonialism and a victim of its own current corrupt leadership. Both things are entirely true.
Okay, I have two final big practical questions for you before we wrap up. First, the infinite liability problem.
Ah, yes.
If we accept this framework of moral debt, does it just go on forever? Do we spend the next 1,000 years litigating who did what to whom in the year 1200? Because basically every nation on Earth has conquered or been conquered at some point.
To avoid what we might call infinite inherited guilt, we have to establish specific, logical limits to historical responsibility. You can't just trace grievances back to the Bronze Age. You have to consider a matrix of factors. The sheer seriousness of the original wrong, the strength of the historical and documentary evidence, the demonstrable continuity of the institutions involved, whether the negative consequences are still actively ongoing today, and the actual practical feasibility of making repair in the present.
So, a well-documented theft of resources by a colonial mining corporation that still exists today, whose victims' descendants are demonstrably impoverished right now, is a very strong, actionable claim.
Very strong.
But a vague historical grievance about a border skirmish from 400 years ago, where the institutions have completely vanished and populations have entirely assimilated, is a very weak claim.
Precisely. The stronger, the more direct, and the more traceable those connections are, the stronger the moral claim for repair.
Second question. Let's look at a hypothetical scenario. Let's say a country was brutally exploited historically. Colonized, resources drained, the whole bit.
Okay.
But through sheer grit, changing global markets, incredible local leadership, or maybe the discovery of a new resource, they managed to become incredibly wealthy. Let's say a formerly colonized nation becomes a top 10 global economic superpower.
A major success story.
Right. Is the historical debt magically erased just because they are rich now?
The answer relies on a brilliant parallel to ordinary everyday justice. It depends entirely on what the debt is actually for.
Okay, break that down.
If the obligation is purely based on the fact that they are currently poor and need help, a charity model, then yes, prosperity erases the obligation. But if the debt is for a specific historical wrong, like a massive theft of resources, stolen artifacts, or unpaid labor that was never repaired, then becoming wealthy later does not retroactively make the original theft acceptable.
Ah, the stolen car analogy.
Exactly.
If I break into your garage and steal your car, and you suffer for years taking the bus, but then 10 years later you invent a new app, you win the lottery, and you become a multimillionaire, the fact that you are now rich doesn't mean I didn't steal your car.
Exactly right.
I still stole it. I still owe you a car, or the value of that car. Your current wealth doesn't magically absolve my past crime.
Exactly. Poverty and historical injustice are deeply related, they often overlap, but they are distinct issues. Repairing a specific wrong is about justice, regardless of the victim's current bank account balance.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an absolutely incredible amount of ground today. Let's try to summarize the core thesis of this massive journey we've been on.
It's been a lot.
We started by questioning the default language of aid and generosity. We walked through the anatomy of a moral debt, distinguishing guilt from inherited responsibility.
A stolen house analogy.
Right. We explored how continuous institutions, states, banks, universities, inherit both assets and liabilities. We looked at the deep architecture of extraction, from the unpaid labor of slavery to the structural damage of arbitrary borders, and how that extraction continues right now, today, through illicit financial flows, unequal trade, and the devastating impacts of climate change.
And we've explored what genuine repair actually looks like in practice. Not writing blank checks to dictators, but canceling crippling sovereign debt, sharing green technology, returning cultural heritage, and reforming global systems to restore autonomy and fairness.
The ultimate shift in perspective here is move away from the comfortable question, how generous should rich countries be, to asking a much harder, much more structural question.
Hey.
How much of our supposed generosity is actually just the repayment of an outstanding debt?
Where prosperity was partly built through unjust relationships with ongoing, measurable consequences, justice requires repair. That is the heartbeat of this entire framework. It's not about punishment. It's about restoration.
Now, as promised, before we let you go, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Something to think about.
Something for you to mull over that builds on everything we've discussed today, but stretches it into the immediate future. We talked about climate debt as a modern version of extraction. But as we were preparing for this deep dive, I couldn't help but think about the world we were building right this very second.
You're thinking about the digital economy.
I am. We are moving incredibly fast into an era utterly dominated by artificial intelligence and massive global data economies. And what is the fundamental raw material of AI? What fuels it?
It's data.
It's data. It's human behavior, language, art, preferences, and digital labor.
And that data is being mined globally, constantly. Every time someone in the global south uses a smartphone, participates in a gig economy app, or provides low-wage data labeling and content moderation for massive tech companies, they are generating the raw material that powers and trains the AI models of the future.
Exactly. But where is the wealth from that AI accumulating? The immense market valuations, the intellectual property, the trillions of dollars in projected profits, they are not being distributed globally.
No, they aren't.
They're being heavily hoarded in a tiny handful of incredibly wealthy tech hubs in North America and Europe.
It's a fascinating and perhaps terrifying parallel. We have essentially moved from extracting physical minerals and agricultural goods from the earth to extracting digital behavior and cognitive labor from populations.
So the question for you to mull over as you go about your week is this. Are we right now actively participating in a brand new, borderless form of extraction?
A digital extraction.
And if we are, how on earth will the generations of tomorrow calculate the moral debt of the digital age? 50 or 100 years from now, will they look back at our modern tech monopolies the exact same way we look back at the colonial trading companies of the 1700s?
It strongly suggests that the questions of justice, debt, and extraction aren't just dry history. They are the active blueprint of our immediate future.
They really are. And it brings us right back to where we started. When we look at global wealth and poverty, we desperately want it to be a simple story. We want to believe that hard work and innovation lead to wealth, and bad luck or poor choices lead to poverty.
It's a comforting thought.
It is, but the reality is that the landscape is incredibly murky. The wealth of one nation is often deeply, uncomfortably entangled with the poverty of another. The waters are muddy, but just because you can't see the bottom doesn't mean the historical currents aren't pulling you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep questioning the structures around you.